So today we're going to be doing portrait drawing with Conte on toned paper. I have here my Conte, black, white, and then two reds or earth tones, and my toned gray paper. I'm using a charcoal paper that has just a little bit of tooth, and I've already drawn into it the basic proportions of a face that I'm going to build from. Today I'm going to be doing a self-portrait, so I just set up my zoom camera directly in front of me so that I have a clear line of sight between my drawing and my subject. I highly recommend, whatever your setup is, make sure that you can see both your drawing and your subject at the same time. Before I spend any time drawing, I'm just going to spend some time looking, maybe taking some proportional measurements, adjusting this framework that I've laid out on the page, just getting familiar with my subject and their specific features. Once I've taken the time to look, I'm going to start by drawing in the highlights. You'll notice that I'm using just a small section of my Conte. I find it's easier to handle than the full Conte, and that way I can also use the side of it to make some really broad strokes. I also like starting with the highlights because the white can easily get muddied by the gray and the earth tones, so I find I can get cleaner brights by putting my lightest areas in first. So what I'm doing now is just kind of pulling out the highlights that I see in the face. Not necessarily all the light areas, but the lightest of light areas. I sometimes find it helpful to mark on my page where my light sources are coming from. In this case, I have a light source from above on both the left and the right, which is why I'm getting highlights on either side of my face. Since my light sources in this case are coming from above, I can intuit that most of my highlights will be on the upward facing planes of my face, like my forehead, cheekbones, nose, anything that is kind of tilted upwards. I find that it can actually be helpful to start to sketch in some of those planes to start visualizing what all the different geometric shapes are and how they're positioned to create the form of the face. Especially if you're doing a self-portrait, I find it can actually be helpful to physically feel with your hands the different planes on your face and start to get a sense of what planes are tilting forward, what are tilting down, what kind of goes back into space. I find this helpful for starting to visualize in 3 dimensions the different areas of light and shadow and why those areas of light and shadow are appearing in the face. Once I feel like I've established most of my highlights, my lightest light areas, I'm going to start going in and pulling out my shadows. And again, this isn't all the areas of shadow in the face, but the areas of most intense shadow is what I'm going to start with. And I'm not making too dark of a mark, just starting really lightly to sketch in these shadows. I can always go darker, but it's harder to lighten a shadow that you've put in really dark. Because we're working with toned paper, the gray of the paper is our mid-tone. So we're really just developing the lightest areas of the face and the darkest areas, and using those to bring out the form of our portrait. There's a tendency to want to fill the entire page with some sort of mark. But in this case, we can really let the gray of the paper do a lot of the work for us and kind of almost sculpt the face out of the page. I'm going to continue to pull out these shadow areas, starting to add more definition to the specific features of the face, and may even go back and forth between using some of my black Conte and some of the white Conte, adding in highlights while I'm pulling out shadows. When it comes to the form of the hair, you can also approach that as a simple shape. So here I'm just adding in roughly some value shapes that will stand in for the hair and that I'll develop further later on in the drawing. I'm going to speed the video up here so that we can see the drawing develop a little quicker. At this point, the drawing doesn't look like much. It's really just a series of geometric shapes arranged on a page. Triangle for the bottom of the nose, another longer triangle for the mouth, some triangles for the eyelids. It's really just a series of triangles in both shadow and light. But as I'm working on the drawing, I'm slowly going to be adding definition, slowly making these shapes a little bit more specific, a little more organic and rounded, and adding in more contrast between the light and the dark areas. At this point, I'm also going to go back in with my white Conte and pull out my highlights a little bit more, add some variation between the light areas that I have on the page, and keep going back and forth between using my white chalk and my black chalk. I mentioned earlier that Conte muddies easily, especially the white Conte. By that I mean it doesn't necessarily blend very nicely, and the black and white, when drawn over one another, will just create a gray that you don't have much control over. So I try to do my best to keep my light areas where I'm using the white and the shadow areas where I'm using the black Conte very separate from one another. You may have noticed that I haven't drawn my glasses. I've kind of mentally omitted them from this view that I'm taking in of myself. I find that it's a lot easier to create the realistic light and shadow areas of the face if I don't have the shadows of my glasses kind of confusing that. So they'll be one of the last things that I add into this portrait. I'm also not using my eraser too much. Conte is not the most eraser-friendly material. You can erase it, especially with a kneaded eraser, but I find that once you make a mark with Conte, it's really hard to completely remove that mark from the page. So I find that if I work really lightly to start with, and then gradually build up my shadow areas, that's more successful than going too dark and then being left with a mark that I can't erase from the page. I'm starting to get more specific about the facial features now. Even as I'm getting more specific, I'm still just using shapes to bring out these features, not necessarily line. The mouth, for example, I haven't outlined it, but instead I'm creating the illusion or the impression of a mouth using a shadow shape that kind of creates the downward facing plane of the upper lip, and then another shadow and a small highlight under the bottom lip. There's actually no information in that bottom lip, but through the shadow shapes on either side of it, I'm kind of implying that middle value shape. The same is the case with the ears and the nose and the eyes. I'm really just using these shapes to sort of imply information and let the viewer fill in the rest. Now that I've finally got the facial features to a place that I'm pretty happy with, I'm going to start adding in the glasses so that I can further capture the likeness. And then the last step is I'm going to start using the red Conte just to add some areas of warmth. And by that I mean both color warmth, using a red, which is a warm color, and also kind of physical warmth, connecting to those areas of the face that often are the most expressive, like the eyes or the nose, or often have the most physical warmth, like the ears. I'm wrapping up the portrait now. There's not a ton of information on the page. We're actually seeing a lot of the gray of the paper coming through. But the information that is here is enough to really strongly imply the form of the face and allow the portrait to kind of naturally emerge from the paper. This was a relatively small drawing, about the size of my hand, and took me roughly 15 minutes. You're obviously not always going to be facing your subject head on. So I wanted to take a minute to address how to approach a portrait when you have maybe an unusual angle that you're viewing your subject at. We talked earlier about how you can view the head as a series of interlocking ovals that fit into a square. We can then think about the skull as something that would fit within kind of a cube-like shape, something that has the same height as it does depth. Based on what we've discussed previously about perspective, using that kind of cube structure to build the head around can help us get the facial features in the right perspective. Using that cube can help us find the center line on the face or the midline where the eyes are at and have that actually be in the correct perspective. For example, if you're looking at someone from a 3/4 view, as I've started to sketch out here, the center line isn't going to be in the center of that oval. It's going to be slightly to the side. So you're seeing more of one side of someone's face and less of another. And using these cubes can help us plan that out. As you can see here, I'm starting to develop these heads in different directions. In one case, with a view that's above and to the left, and in the other case with a view that's below and to the right. Understanding how perspective affects how we perceive the face can open up opportunities for creating some really dynamic portraits.